Chapter 1. Research. The greatest discovery of humankind was not fire for warmth and cooking, or the wheel for travel, or any other physical revelation of the sort. The greatest human discovery was the scientific method. It has directly or indirectly, intentionally or inadvertently, delivered nearly every material benefit humans have enjoyed throughout history. We owe everything from our creation and manipulation of fire to medical marvels to refrigeration and microwave power to the electricity that facilitates all of them to science and its bedfellow mathematics. Application of the scientific method took us from 8 seconds of air suspension in 1903 to 87-ton metallic birds transporting thousands of people across the globe every hour in a span of about 50 years. That's why Dr. Ali Wallace treasured science. It's what drove him through the tedious portions of the practice. Contrary to what he was led to believe as a child, real science wasn't all mysteriously bubbling beakers and Bunsen burners. It wasn't lab coats and explosions. It was much more a microcosm of real life. Long stretches of tedious routines separated by periodic failures and intense milestones of celebration. As a scientist, he was a problem solver. He was one of the people who dug through scholarly articles of his peers, then labored in labs for hours on end. As a contemporary lab technician in America, he never expected to join the pantheon of classic names like Einstein, Darwin, Tesla, or Newton. He didn't even expect to end up among those who even more closely resembled him, like Carver, Quarterman, or Tyson, even if he hoped his work may rival the impact of something like peanut butter or the Manhattan Project. Ali had secured a grant to do in-depth studies on carbon monoxide, CO. He hoped his work would save lives or reduce the cases and impact of CO poisoning. At the time, there were 20,000 to 50,000 cases of CO poisoning per year, sending up to 400 to an early grave. One could argue 400 deaths are trivial compared to the annual 61,000 from influenza or 1.25 million from car accidents in the same country. Why not be one of the scientists who eradicates influenza or an engineer who improves automotive collision safety? Despite his scientific and mathematical mind, Ali was no strict pragmatist or utilitarian. He valued human lives over American dollars. Inefficient. He valued kindness over strength. Emotional. That number of 400 people hung in the air around him like a potent gas no one else could detect. Those deaths were so much more preventable than a car accident. The number was greater than everyone he could have considered among his real family and friends. He would imagine the impact of everyone he considered close to him suddenly gone from preventable causes. It was nearly double the number of black men killed by police every year. He imagined the ability to save that many people twice if he only looked hard enough for a solution. It was nearly double the size of an average graduating class. He would imagine an entire football field of caps and gowns in June, dozens of teachers and hundreds of teenagers preparing to embark on their lives, then disappearing all at once. What if we had more reliable methods of detection, engineering? What if we had better solutions for reducing the rate that CO flooded the bloodstream, biology? What if we didn't assume that 400 was the best we were ever going to do? Scientists who do meaningful work ask quality questions. Irrational passions are typically regarded as negative and quite the opposite of scientific research, but the what and the why of one's work are rarely in sync. Few who devote themselves to selling cars or extracting coal from dingy mines do so as an act of passion or because they consider them rational ways to spend the prime years of their lives. Their labor is an end to a means, and sometimes the connective tissue between the two is rational, other times it isn't. There was a logical formula dictating Ali's lifestyle at this time, driven by his abstract passion for driving the number 400 down into double digits. His work was funded by a 1-year grant pending more time and resources if he could deliver promising results. X amount of funds minus E amount of funding divided by T amount of time always came out to the same results. There was never enough funding nor time to meet Ali's ambition. He couldn't self-finance his research, cut corners with materials, nor extend his deadlines. That left him with only one factor he could influence personally: how efficiently he used his time and how much of it he gave to each day. He couldn't add to the 24 hours he had each day, but he could increase the percentage of those hours he spent working to maximize the productivity of his grant. Put simply, if he doubled his time at work and was able to perform just as effectively, it would be as if the grant were for 2 years rather than 1. As for most professions, some scientists in his position did the bare minimum, working their contracted hours, going back to their happy homes, and hoping to yield promising enough results to ensure their ongoing job security when deadlines arrived. Crystal, Ali's research assistant, could be counted among those dispassionate scientists, at least while working on the CO project. Though she was too young to be a romantic interest of his, he could admit her smooth chocolate skin and dark curly hair made her easy on the eyes, especially in contrast to their exclusively shared environment of a dull and sterile lab. It was no secret this particular work did not inspire her the way it did him, but he still enjoyed seeing a young woman of color show great promise in a STEM field. When he was an undergrad, there were no women in most of his 300 level and higher classes, and he was the only black student in any of them. Crystal was a university intern, getting paid for her work in college credits and resume padding. While she didn't mind the tedious experiments and constant collection of data, she hated Ali's policy that required their cell phones remain in their cars to give undivided attention to their work. Ali was old enough to value this separation from the pings and buzzes of social media and an attention-hungry jungle of advertisements online. His Generation Z undergrad lab assistant would never think of leaving her phone in a car if she had a choice in the matter. Despite her overall disinterest in the project, Crystal gave Ali hope for the next generation. Sure, she loved her cell phone and fell victim to a somewhat short attention span, but she was evidence that such a person could still be proficient in scientific fieldwork where discipline and tedium were staples. Her patience and self-discipline were all the more impressive knowing she was demonstrating them in an unpaid internship for which she had little personal interest. She was punctual and diligent in her work, although sometimes somber. When it was time for her to go, she wasn't spurred on by constantly accumulating ghosts of CO victims like Ali was. It's generally unwise to invest your passion into stepping stones. One might compare it to getting romantically involved with a one-night stand. Crystal always left on time, and Ali always worked late, losing himself in the numbers and the graphs. Chapter 2. Slumber. The majority of formal dream study is done during the rapid eye movement, REM, phase of slumber, which accounts for 20 to 25% of sleep time. It's also known as paradoxal sleep because brain scans of REM show the brain appears to be both awake and in deep sleep simultaneously. It's the time when the brain is most resistant to waking up. Heart rate and breathing increase during REM, and the parts of the brain which handle memory and motion have higher blood flow than during most waking hours. It's no surprise that the prefrontal cortex, which handles reason, logic, and self-awareness, is particularly inactive during REM, explaining why dreams seem so irrational. REM cycles tend to go longer as we sleep longer, which is one reason the most vibrant and memorable dreams tend to occur before we wake up in the morning. Ali found himself deep in such a state that he quickly reasoned it could only be a dream. However, it seemed so real that he found himself trapped in what he could only rationalize as the paradox of REM, an immersive state of being where he felt both asleep and awake, in control of his actions and along for the ride. He was self-aware enough to tell he must be dreaming, but not enough to enjoy the limitless nature of one's dream state. He couldn't choose to fly or otherwise break the laws of physics as one might in the few golden moments between dream self-awareness and the cruelty of an alarm clock. Ali felt so restricted and almost trapped in this dream that he would have preferred to be awake, where he could at least enjoy the benefits of physical perception beyond his imagination. It began with the sound of muffled chatter and the click of a shutting door. Ali's head rose from his desk. This happened so many times it was difficult to separate recurring reality from recurring dreams. So many partial nights were spent this way. There was no need to leave the lab with so much work to be done. They were closing in on a breakthrough, something they could use to convince investors this project was worthwhile. Sleep was essential, but he had an occasional habit of avoiding it until it crept up and snatched him from his spreadsheets and data points. About once each week, he would find himself squeezing more work from himself by avoiding the time it took to drive home, eat, shower, sleep in his bed, awaken, eat again, and drive back. So many steps, so much time could be saved by cutting them out. The granola bars in his desk provided sufficient calories, a spritz of cologne would substitute a shower in a pinch, and who needed a queen-size memory foam mattress when a wide metal desk covered in post-it notes included a convenient laptop nightlight. Ali's first hint that he must have been dreaming was the lack of rumble in his stomach. He had hastily bolted down a microwave dinner hours before collapsing onto his desk around midnight. The bottom right of his laptop screen informed him it was 8 a.m. on October 13th. He would have been asleep for nearly 8 hours. Not only was it painfully rare that he slept that late or that long, but he should have been craving bacon and eggs and settling for dry granola by then. No such hunger nagged at him, so he knew something was off. As he stretched his arms, his eyes scanned the lab. The lack of natural light in the room had a way of making time stand still, not unlike casinos engineered to keep patrons from feeling how late it was getting. Keep the chips piling, keep the bets coming, keep the data compiling, keep the tests running. On that note, if this were the real world, Crystal would have arrived an hour ago and politely woke him as she had several times before. The lab was undisturbed, no experiments, noises, or signs of Crystal, who had never been a minute late, let alone an hour. It would have been impossible for anyone to enter without immediately noticing Ali at his desk due to the size of the lab and how close it was to the door. This scrappy setup was more of a glorified closet, and Ali deduced that actually was its original function. It wasn't a complex conclusion given the absence of windows and the presence of power outlets and Ethernet ports which didn't match those in the rest of the building. They did have the best ventilation on campus thanks to equipment first installed with the grant. Safety was a top priority for experimenting with a gas known as the Invisible Killer. The door was modified to be airtight, and with the push of a button from either side of the door, the air in the room could be sucked out and immediately replaced in a matter of minutes. Sometimes restrictions offered advantages. The lab's small size made it easy to vent, easy to clean, and less expensive to customize with specialized ventilation. He had a desk of his own, a workbench for himself and his assistant, a few shelves and racks for supplies, and excellent artificial lighting. What more did they need? With a project that couldn't afford more personnel or equipment, extra space would have just gotten in the way. He pushed back his chair and began to move from his desk when he received the second clue he was dreaming. While his vision and hearing were just as sharp as when he was fully awake, the desk felt strange beneath his hands and the floor felt odd beneath his feet. The most damning evidence was that when he looked back down, his chair evidently had pushed itself back into place. It was impossible that anyone else had pushed it back, as he was the only one in the room. It was impossible that some supernatural force had pushed the chair, and what motive would a supernatural entity have for pushing a chair in? Occam's razor sliced on the side of Ali, being lost in an immersive dream world, with his eyes dashing rapidly beneath their lids as he rested. He even allowed himself to indulge in a sly smile, proud of his prefrontal cortex for being involved enough for him to be this self-aware of the dream. As he took it in, comfortable in his confidence none of it was real, he determined this dream did have a rather ghastly feel. He considered the cool autumn air outside of the lab and how he must have fallen asleep to one too many horror movies recently or let a few Halloween decorations slip into his subconscious over the last few days. He couldn't quite place the feel of uneasiness as he took a few more steps from his desk, looking over the lab, almost impressed with his subconscious memory of the minute details and sharp images. Every piece of equipment seemed in its place, but something just didn't feel right, especially that chair silently moving itself back under the desk. He knew for numerous reasons there was no need to fear ghouls, spirits, or curses, no matter how strange the lab felt this morning. He chuckled to himself at the stereotypically terrible misrepresentation of science in most zombie movies. Despite what he could only describe to himself as a haunting chill in the air that made it feel like he was being watched, Ali exhaled a sigh of relief, reminding himself that he certainly could never believe in ghosts, even if he was moments away from meeting one. Chapter 3. Dream Girl. Ali really didn't have time to sleep this late. If his dream was this vivid, he knew he had to have been in a deep REM cycle. There was too much work to be done for him to indulge in extra sleep. Usually falling asleep on the desk meant he would wake up sooner and stiffer. That reminded him that his upper back felt normal. Despite being hunched over a metal desk for several hours, the typical crick in his neck was replaced by an eerie chill down his spine while he explored the lab as if it were some video game replica of a real place. He even considered continuing his work in the dream world before dismissing it as absurd. There were many late nights when he regretted the level of ambition in his grant proposal. Of course, he would have loved to have more time and/or the ability to focus more on one part of the research, but he needed to convince funders of potential commercial applications for his research findings. That required casting a wide net in this study of a well-understood gas that already had methods for detection and medical practices to treat. Because treatment for accidental carbon monoxide poisoning costs the U.S. healthcare system more than $1.3 billion every year, proof that he could market a product to prevent the problem, treat it less expensively, or avoid it entirely would be enticing for private or public grants in the future. His most promising application was a far more effective CO detector that plugged in like a nightlight and sent alerts directly to an app on a smartwatch or cell phone. The most common CO detectors were those combined with smoke detectors. Too many homeowners didn't even realize the difference. They all grew up learning about house fires. They had fire drills at school and learned how to stop, drop, and roll. Children learned the danger of inhaling smoke, but the danger of carbon monoxide leaks, that was usually relegated to a passing comment in high school chemistry class. It seemed so backwards the more Ali contemplated it, and he reasoned it came down to education. Any land animal knows that smoke and fire are hazardous. They know to get low and get away from the smoke and avoid touching the fire and just get out. Meanwhile, grown adults live their daily lives without functioning CO detectors in their homes, oblivious to the threat of lethal gas they can't perceive with their senses until it's too late. Far too many Americans heard a beep from their CO detectors, assumed it was a false smoke alarm, turned it off, and lost their lives. What came next was Ali's first indication this wasn't a pleasant or even neutral dream. The lab door opened and a human figure entered. While every other object and surface in this dream was remarkably realistic, this figure was anything but. Its shape and movements were almost certainly feminine, and she was cast in a ghastly blur as if Ali were looking at a corpse under water through heavy humidity. Her figure was reduced to an almost monochromatic color palette of greens from pale to black. Ali was too struck with the mingling of fascination and amusement to feel terror at first, captivated by how different this feminine apparition appeared from the world around her, until she turned to look directly at him. He could detect no expression from her sunken black eyes and mossy face, but he read body language well enough to interpret this ghost was just as fascinated by his presence as he was by hers. Emboldened by assuring himself in the safety of his own dream world, he cautiously moved closer as she did the same. Eventually, she lifted what appeared to be a hand at the end of her outstretched arm. He mimicked the gesture, and her hand phased effortlessly through his. They both jumped back from each other, and he backed into the wall. She spun to bolt from the room, bumping the desk and slamming the door behind her. He clutched his phased-through hand to warm it from the chill her touch provoked. Stammering to himself by how real this felt, Ali began to panic at the idea this wasn't a dream, as he heard haunting wails fade into the distance on the other side of the airtight door. Was it possible he was really awake in his lab right now, and that something happened causing disturbing occurrences like furniture that could move itself, or ghostly women appearing before him and running away? Where would Occam's razor slice on this one? Could any of his experiments from the previous day have caused him to hallucinate? Could he have been drugged without knowing it? What motive could anyone have for that? Had he snapped into insanity or delusions from sleep deprivation? That might be it. It was starting to make sense. Ali had burned the candle at both ends for far too long. He had cheated himself of too much sleep, and his mind and body must have reached a cutoff point. Some kind of comatose or fever dream must have caused him to see such things. He took a steady breath, preparing himself for whatever might be on the other side of the door as he gripped the handle to exit the lab, but it didn't budge. The doorway was either a limit to his dream, or a damn ghost locked him in the lab with a key left jammed in the opposite side. For the time being, he wasn't going anywhere unless he woke up, which was fine by him. If he wasn't allowed to wake up, at the very least he deserved some time to think. Stumbling back to the desk and into his seat, Ali reached for his stainless steel water bottle. He wished for something stronger to calm his nerves, but a gulp of water might wake him up, or at least address the feeling of dry mouth that set in the moment the ghost ran her hand through his. He took a slow sip that became a long, draining gulp. When his shaking hand returned the bottle to its original spot, he noticed the weight of the bottle never seemed to change. His hand shot back before lifting the bottle again to find it seemed he never took a drink. That occurrence, combined with how disturbingly real this managed to feel, shocked him into dropping the bottle in front of him, spilling over the surface. Then, as he blinked, he found the full bottle, still sealed in its original position, with the desk bone dry. Rather than panicking at the notion of some kind of haunting spirit or curse in his lab, Ali took a breath, assuring himself this meant he must be dreaming, and dreams are safe. Chapter 4. Ghosts Aren't Real. As a scientist, Ali knew it was bullheaded and counterproductive to dismiss potential solutions out of hand. Previously established facts have been disproven hundreds of times over the centuries. That has always been foundational in making the most current version of science's body of knowledge as accurate as possible. The rules are updated as new data comes to light. Scientists do not stubbornly cling to old rules and facts for the sake of pride. On the contrary, they seek to disprove the current body of knowledge. If they fail to disprove it, they revel in the predictability of the laws we have established, and if they find a new way to disprove a law, it is celebrated as discovery rather than castigated as heresy. As such, Ali remained open to any set of circumstances that could explain his situation. Could he genuinely rule out anything from his list? 1. I am dreaming. 2. I am under the influence of an unknown substance. 3. I am in a state of sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations. 4. My experiments have caused hallucinations. 5. Some combination of 1 through 4. 6. I am awake and well, but my laboratory is really haunted. Possibility 1 would be ideal, but he had mounting concerns that this may not strictly be a dream. His experience was too long and lucid to be a typical dream. Too much of it followed the rules of reality. It was too clear and sterile, matching reality down to the numbers on the barcodes of the vials and test tubes or the marks and numbers on the graduated cylinders. This REM cycle was lasting far too long, and this level and length of self-awareness was unrealistic at best. If this was a dream, it was a bizarre deviation from all the other dreams he could ever recall experiencing. Why now? Possibility 2 seemed plausible. Spare the lack of evident financial or emotional motivation for anyone to drug him. Why would they? He only left his home to work and only left his work to eat and sleep. He had to admit gaps in his knowledge with this option, however, as he strictly abstained from substances that altered his mind unless prescribed by a physician. He had never been drunk nor tried drugs, not even in college, where alcohol illegally flowed through the young bodies of his peers like water. It was possible he was experiencing effects of any number of drugs, but he wouldn't know due to experiential ignorance of how any drugs would affect him. He contemplated the linguistic irony of being a student of science who never experimented with drugs. Still, the lack of motive for anyone to drug him against his will pushed this option from his mind. Possibility 3 seemed the most likely, but also quite difficult to do anything about. Its implications were also unclear. Was he in a comatose state, having fever dreams, the likes of which no one could explain, or was he fully awake and really here, but seeing irrational things like skewed perversions of object permanence or easily frightened feminine specters? He knew that he lacked sleep and that sleep deprivation could have taken a brutal toll on his mind, but he didn't fully understand what that meant for him or how to respond. Possibility 4 was essentially not a possibility at all. He had spent the last 2 days running numbers on a prototype. He wasn't using any new materials or methods that hadn't been done dozens of times in this same lab under these same conditions. Possibility 6 was the most frightening option, but he was relieved to logically consider it the least likely. Anyone with a cursory understanding of physics knew that ghosts were incompatible with reality. For a ghost to be real, it would need to account for so many factors. 1. Ghosts or anything capable of invisibility would be rendered blind. Anything with invisible retinas couldn't see. Light needs to bounce off of an image and an ocular sensor for the information of sight to reach the brain. As when he first contemplated this as a teenager, Ali smirked to himself at the notion of an invisible ghost stumbling around a stereotypical haunted mansion, bumping into coat racks or walls because it couldn't see. Science had a way of making supernatural threats seem so silly. Number 2. What does a ghost weigh? Ali remembered asking one of his middle school English teachers that question after reading some spooky story as a class. It stuck out as one of the first contradictions he experienced in school. His English teacher told him ghosts were weightless, but he knew the implications that had for ghosts based on science class, and he laughed out loud just based on 2 of many data points from astronomy. The Earth rotates at about 1,000 miles per hour and orbits the Sun at roughly 67,000 miles per hour at the same time. The only thing keeping anything from flying off the Earth's surface at tens of thousands of miles per hour is gravity. Gravity can only affect things with atomic mass, so a weightless ghost would fly off into the vacuum of space. If the answer were changed, for example, to ghosts weighing almost nothing, it opened further questions. What accounted for their atomic mass? What elements made the ghosts undead bodies? Were they made of carbon or some other element? It seemed more logical that they might be made of gas. On that note, a ghost made of too light of an element might not fly away faster than the speed of sound, but it would still float away like a helium balloon. Number 3, in order to see a ghost, it must contain photons of solid matter, because light can only be emitted or reflected by photons. Just as light needs to bounce off of a ghost's eye so it can see, light needs to bounce off of the ghost itself for anyone to see it. In Ali's case, he saw a ghost, so it must be made of photons and it must contain some kind of mass. Number 4. How silly is it to think that ghosts can walk through walls without sinking through floors or the ground itself? What, in accordance with the laws of physics, makes a wall conducive to harmlessly passing through that is different from the physical properties of a floor? Adults who claimed ghosts could exist never explained these things, which exposed them for how little they really knew about ghosts, let alone physics. Ali grinned at his desk, reflecting on the logical problems with the notion of being locked in a haunted lab. Despite his reasoning, each passing moment made it feel less likely he was dreaming all of this. Then, something was pulled to the front of his mind. The same brain he used to earn a PhD finally registered the first thing he saw that ghost do. She didn't pass through a wall like the ghosts in stories or scary movies. She opened the door. What kind of spirit opens and closes a damn door? What kind of ghost locks a door? In a dream, anyone and anything a subconscious mind cooks up can do anything imaginable. How could he accept that he was having an extremely lucid dream in which his subconscious produced a perfect replica of his lab where green ghosts needed to open doors and got scared of people and locked those same doors? His head swirled as he wondered if it was senseless enough to work its way back around to being plausible for a dream. It wasn't. Chapter 5. Deductions. Ali decided to prepare for the worst-case scenario. He ran through his cursory checklist of things that made ghosts absurd, but he was too focused on dismissing the depictions of spirits in traditional media. He now contemplated the strict reality of his empirical observations and began making deductions, this time removing the convenient assumption that he was dreaming. Premise 1. I am real. Premise 2. The chair is real. Premise 3. An object at rest will remain at rest until or unless acted upon by an outside force. Premise 4. I have accounted for known outside forces such as gravity and friction. Conclusion 1. An unseen outside force in the room pushed the chair. Premise 1. I am real. Premise 2. The laws of physics are sound in reality. Premise 3. The water bottle did not obey the laws of physics. Conclusion 2. The water bottle isn't real or is somehow exempt from the laws of physics. More data needed. When Ali looked to the stainless steel bottle to consider another test, he made a new observation. There was a light ring of condensation on the desk from where the bottle had been before. Something moved the bottle from the position he was unable to change before. He quickly considered the only circumstance that may have changed something. Premise 1. I could not move the bottle permanently. Premise 2. The ghost moved the bottle when she bumped the desk. Premise 3. The ghost's action could move the bottle. Conclusion 3. The ghost can move unreal objects or those unbound to physical laws. Had the ghost's impact on the bottle restored it to reality or broken some kind of curse that prevented him from moving it permanently? He proceeded with his experiment by tipping it over with his fingers. Before the bottle could hit the desk, it vanished and reappeared, but still beside the initial ring. It reappeared where the ghost had moved it, not to the spot where the condensation ring indicated it had been before. In an act of frustration and curiosity, Ali gripped the metal bottle, cocked back his arm, and threw it at the door with all his might. Before it could reach the door, it dissolved in the air and reappeared on the desk, right beside the ring again. This time, he lifted the bottle above the desk and held on. 5, 10, 30 seconds went by before he extended his arm to drop the bottle on the floor. As he hypothesized, a short moment after it left his hand, it reappeared on the desk to where the ghost had moved it. Though he was gaining new information, including predictable, repeatable results, he was frustrated by how it only led to more questions. Ali slammed the laptop shut and stood back from his desk, kicking the chair aside. He fumed internally when the chair didn't even reach the wall beside it before it reappeared in place at the desk, with his laptop open exactly as it was before. He stumbled back, running his hands through his short hair, trying to relax, when a sudden calm of curiosity washed over him. He clapped his hands together, then looked over at the empty chair. He thought of the ghost's behavior. Premise 1. I cannot permanently move inanimate objects. Premise 2. I can permanently move myself. Premise 3. I cannot pass through objects, nor can they pass through me. Premise 4. The ghost cannot pass through objects, nor can they pass through her. Premise 5. The ghost's hand passed through mine and or my hand passed through hers. Premise 6. I can see the ghost. Premise 7. The ghost is bound to the earth by gravity. Conclusion 4. The ghost is composed of matter that has significant atomic mass. Ali dashed across the room to a microscope and pulled out a tissue sample on a glass slide. Careful not to break contact with the sample to prevent it disappearing like everything else in this cursed closet of a lab, he held it carefully in place while peering through the lens. The organic tissue looked like nothing he had seen under a microscope before. No matter how much he adjusted the focus, the organic cells were like characters from a 1990s Game Boy screen, a blurry collection of monochromatic greens. Chapter 6. Perspective. Crystal arrived at the parking lot outside of the research facility at 2 a.m. on October 13th, as she had for several nights in a row. She had been checking for Dr. Wallace's car. It was parked in his usual spot with that corny bumper sticker that read, "My chemistry puns never get a reaction." She casually entered the lab with her key, knowing the only security was an alarm system to alert campus cops of intruders. Dr. Wallace couldn't have set the alarm on his way out if he hadn't left. She made her way confidently to the lab and quietly opened the door, finding her supervisor as she had several times before. The lights were on, his laptop was open, and his face was flat on the desk, lost in a deep and desperate slumber. For a moment, she pitied this man who gave so much time to what seemed like such a trivial cause. She was pleased that working with him had given her what she needed to file a patent for a more efficient and modern carbon monoxide detector, and they were in the final steps of their initial prototype. She no longer needed him and was disinclined to spend the next 6 months under his lead while she could take over and secure the patents for herself. Grad school wasn't going to be free, after all. All she needed was access to the lab, and they would surely let the intern finish out the grant if she could prove that they were close to a breakthrough. Her glowing evaluations from Dr. Wallace would vouch for her competence. Crystal only had 3 targets. The first 2 were CO detectors, a double redundancy carefully calibrated to alert the lab if a tank leaked or an experiment got out of control. She simply switched off both detectors while Dr. Wallace snored at his desk, then made her way to the final target. She barely stopped walking as she held her breath, twisted open the valve of one of the 550-liter carbon monoxide tanks, and quietly shut the airtight door behind her. She switched off the custom ventilation system with the keypad outside the door and left without a second thought. Just before 7 o'clock a.m. on the 13th, Crystal arrived back at the lab as she did every morning. This time, she immediately and discreetly turned on the ventilation system. With a press of a button, the system's additional fans and valves kicked in to completely vent the room and replace the air inside. As it did so, she took her phone from her purse to call 911. When the system told her the room was clear, she entered to find Dr. Wallace spread out on the desk as she left him. She checked his pulse with one hand and called 911 with the other. Campus safety arrived in minutes, followed by paramedics who quickly declared Dr. Wallace's death. Police questioned and consoled the pretty young woman through her crocodile tears, easily concluding the accident as a result of a CO mishap. Their work was rushed and sloppy at best. It was nearly 8 a.m. when the paramedics removed the corpse, the door clicking shut behind their muffled voices as Ali's spirit rose in a stupor. As Crystal prepared to drive away for the day, police asked her to simply not touch anything else in the lab until the detectives came by. They had already removed the bodies, so it was no big deal. They wanted a quick look, just as a formality, and she might get a few more questions. That moment, she realized in her rush to get this ugly business behind her, she had left both detectors in the off position. Malfunctioning detectors were plausible, but both detectors switched off would be inherently suspicious. As the police left, she reasoned the detectives would likely conclude the disabled detectors made this a suicide rather than an accident. Carbon monoxide was a common method for ending one's own life. She just didn't want to take chances by giving them a reason to consider motive. As a competent scientist, she knew to account for every variable she could possibly control. After several minutes of the police being out of sight, Crystal power-walked her way back to the lab. She opened the door and rushed inside with only 2 of her previous 3 targets in mind. This time, she stopped in her tracks as a turn of her head revealed the impossible image of a glowing green apparition who stood as if it were just as curious and disturbed as she was. She could not make out its face, but she knew the stature and posture of the ghastly green collection of glowing cells to be eerily similar to the man who had supervised her internship for the last several months. The man whose work she was set to steal after poisoning him with his own lab materials. The scientific nature of Crystal's mind made her curiosity rival her terror, and she observed that the figure did not appear threatening or menacing. She slowly approached, as it did the same, and she reached out. When her shea butter smooth hand passed right through that of the masculine figure, a chill raced through her body. Her eyes shot open wide and she panicked. She attempted to scream, but her tightening throat swallowed her voice, and she turned to run, bumping the desk and slamming the door behind her. Her shaking hands locked the door and left the key inside as she raced down the corridor past other labs, sobbing and screaming as she found her voice, the feelings of terror, guilt, and confusion bubbling from her core and spilling out to anyone who could hear her until campus security found her. Chapter 7. Trapped. When Ali rose from the microscope, his hand released the glass sample slide. As expected, it vanished and instantly reappeared in its place. He briefly allowed himself to smirk at how convenient it would be if things always put themselves where they belonged when people were done. No more missing heads from socket wrench sets or disappearing TV remotes. Of course, this was what he considered a King Midas idea. It seemed appealing at first, but if thought through completely or put into practice, it was obviously terrible. Ideas like a child requesting ice cream at every meal, a greedy king wanting everything he touched to turn to gold, or a modern adult believing in ghosts. It was so obvious now that he wasn't dreaming, and he was disappointed he could fool himself for so long. Ali walked slowly back to his desk and stared at his hands, which became less clear the longer he looked. Usually, the more he stared at something, the more clear it would become. He would notice more tiny details. The opposite was now true, and like the details of his body, his clothing began to fade and blur into his skin. Of course it did. One of the cheeky questions he asked his English teacher, "Do ghosts walk around naked?" It wouldn't make sense for their clothing to cross over with them, because clothing couldn't die. The fact that Ali's clothing and what he knew of his natural body began to fade into a pale green blur the more he objectively stared at himself was evidence that his experiments and deductive exercises included an elementary flaw. He failed to accurately account for the power of bias in his own psyche. The human mind is far more powerful in several more ways than most people consider. The placebo effect has proven occasional instances of genuine mental expectations altering the body's chemistry enough to cause effects similar to those expected. Pareidolia is the known effect of the brain combining its prior knowledge and understanding of patterns with expectations or desires to see things that aren't really there, like the face of a man on the moon, non-existent people in shadow, or Jesus Christ on toast. The human psyche is so powerful that even people who are aware of the dangers of their own biases need to take extensive precautions against influencing their own logical conclusions. Many people make a living taking advantage of innate psychological tendencies to fleece other people out of their money. Successful charlatans, con men, psychics, advertisers, and politicians tend to be the best at it. Those who must combat their own internal bias the most frequently and effectively are scientists. One can imagine how passionately a scientist may desire to finalize a vaccine or cure for a deadly disease or life-saving technology. Of course, if those passionate scientists allow their desires to impact their conclusions, the data becomes corrupt and the conclusions are unreliable. It's obviously better to administer a vaccine that has been double-blind tested and peer-reviewed under multiple conditions than to administer one rushed out by a single scientist who is highly enthusiastic about the initial results of the first trial. Science works because it values replicable, consistent results purged of bias, and Ali failed to account for that when weighing the options of his own condition. He saw his skin and clothes because his psyche could not imagine himself without those things. He convinced himself he could feel the cool steel of his water bottle because he couldn't comprehend not feeling it. His mind used his prior knowledge to fill the gaps and wrapped itself in the comfortable delusion that he was still alive and merely asleep somewhere to dismiss the things it wouldn't fix. He still didn't understand everything, but he could now accept that he was dead. He accepted that he probably looked the same to that ghastly figure as it looked to him. As best he could reason it, he was trapped somewhere between dimensions, where the physical world still restricted him. It may have been a result of his experimental equipment or the stubbornness of his logical mind refusing to accept the spiritual reality of his death, just as he had refused to accept that his corduroys had not died with him. It could have been that his soul was too tied to this dimension by his unfinished business of saving lives. It was at that moment, in his reasoning, that Ali first bothered to ask the most logical question of all. How did he die? He had spent so much time coming to terms with being a bygone spirit trapped between dimensions that he failed to consider his cause of death. There was not a drop of blood or sign of struggle at the desk where he sat during his final living memory. He even double-checked to ensure his mind hadn't betrayed him about that, too. He was no longer a young man, but he was far from elderly or unfit. This lab was designed with safety as a top priority, including not one but two top-of-the-line CO detectors to keep the whole building safe from his experiments. He looked to the detectors, and his blurry eyes snapped open wider. Off. Both detectors were off. It was impossible. He spent the first 10 minutes of every morning examining his safety equipment. How could this happen? What else could he have missed? When he finally checked the large tanks of carbon monoxide stacked in their rack, his mind made another key deduction he needed to accept the truth. Premise 1. The safety equipment was on when I fell asleep. Premise 2. The safety equipment is off now. Premise 3. The CO tank was full with a sealed valve when I fell asleep. Premise 4. The CO tank is empty with an open valve now. Premise 5. Crystal is the only other human with access to this lab for security reasons. Premise 6. Crystal knew we were on the brink of a profitable discovery. Conclusion. Crystal turned off the safety equipment and released the gas. Had his implicit biases not pulled him away from this logical conclusion with tempting assumptions like still being alive or his sweet assistant not being a murderer, he would have deduced this all much sooner. He certainly had the intellectual capacity to make the observations and piece them together much faster than he did. Knowing that his optimism cost him an opportunity to interact with his executioner only further spurned him, as he was now confident the ghostly woman he encountered earlier was Crystal returning to the scene of her crime. He was now left to work with many unknown variables. How long would he be trapped here? Was there a way to fully cross over? What kind of dimension would he enter if he did? Why was this happening? All he could do was make one final deduction until he had more data. Premise 1. I can interact with physical objects so long as I remain in contact with them. Premise 2. Crystal cannot pass through physical objects. Premise 3. Crystal has to come back here at some point if she wishes to profit from my work. Conclusion. I will wait here and hide. I will be an invisible killer.